Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and I'm with Audrey Waters. It's the 11th of February, 2012, and we're gathered together again for another week of EdTech news. How are you, Audrey?
I'm good.
You're making some changes.
I am making some changes. I'm very excited. It sort of dawned on me when I was at EduCon, and I think I was talking with Alec Koros, and he said, "Wow, you're writing like everywhere." And I thought, yeah, and I'm exhausted. And so I'm very excited that thanks to a research project I'm going to be undertaking for Mozilla, a research and writing project, I'm actually going to be writing mostly on hack education instead of everywhere, which is exciting for me.
Well, good. It is interesting because this week you certainly seem to be focusing on software and hacking, and my guess is this is the trend.
Um, I think that those were certainly sort of the things that were on my mind a lot. This week also seemed to be on the phone a lot with different companies based on news that will be coming out next week. So lots of actually, next week is going to be a very interesting week in terms of education news. Not that this week wasn't, but.
Oh, I can't wait. So, okay, web deconstruction with Hackosaurus. This is something I think Richard Stallman would love. Tell us why.
Well, I think that this is a really great tool, and so the work that I should explain, the work that I'm doing for Mozilla is that they're really making some efforts, I think, to think about what it means to be web literate and to help give people the skills and support initiatives that are in the skills for sort of making a web literate world. And Hackosaurus is a tool that they use, that they've developed to help. I don't know if you can quite call it teaching kids to code, but what it does is it sort of peels back the layer of HTML and makes it easier to view the source code in the web page and then actually play around and remix what's on a web page. So you can sort of take the New York Times, for example, and change all the, with Hackosaurus, you can sort of change all the headlines, switch around all of the photos, and then republish your sort of remixed your remixed page. So I think it's a really good tool for getting kids to think about how the web is built, and let them see that they can actually they can sort of do similar things themselves.
Well, the free software geek in me loved this idea of seeing the code, being able to remix it, and then republish. So let's segue from that to this how to teach web building to everyone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is, I think that this year there's been so much buzz, partially because of Codecademy, about people learning to program. And I think that one of the problems with sort of a vague or without actually having a project that you're working on building, it's very hard to sort of know what you want to do in terms of programming. And so what Mozilla is asking me to research is there a need for something like Scratch, right? So that's the wonderful tool from MIT that helps kids think about computational thinking. So is there a need for a comparable tool for HTML5? And so HTML5, I should say, it's not just HTML. It's HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript too. So there are some programmatic features to HTML5. But it's great. I've got a long list of people that I want to talk to about thinking about sort of practically what would this tool look like, how technical would it be, and then also sort of pedagogically, right? How do you teach web building, and is that different than teaching computational thinking, something that Scratch does?
So I rarely disagree with you. I'm not even sure what I'm going to say as a disagreement, but I think there was something really interesting occurred to me as I read this piece. The next one we're going to talk about is EdTech amnesia,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to raise a warning flag here for EdTech myopia, and I'll tell you why. Because I think it's really appealing and really attractive to talk about teaching computer science or teaching programming and how you do it and the best ways to do it. But I don't think that those discussions actually do anything to shift or change education. And in part because I don't think best practices ever convert into narrative shifts in terms of how we think about teaching and learning. And so I'm really intrigued by kind of the energy and the determination that go into this kind of a discussion, which reminds me so much of the open source conversations I've had over the last 5 years that don't end up actually having any impact at all.
That's actually. I mean, I think that that's actually a really important thing to think about. I mean, and it's one of the things I've been thinking about too, when we think about where oftentimes, I mean, very few schools offer computer science, like what I would call a computer science class. They might offer some technology application usage, but computer science is actually not very widely taught. And oftentimes, the things that do happen, they happen in after school, in sort of after school projects or other sorts of weekend group activities. And so this is actually another piece of what I've been thinking about as well, is sort of where are we seeing the shifts, some of these shifts occur, and what happens when all of our energies for innovative programs, and then also ones that are sort of really thinking about how the teaching and learning happens. What happens if those are just happening in after-school programs and at libraries? Is that sort of what are the implications when that happens? I'm not sure that's answering quite what you said, but
Well, no, I'm seeing this a lot in the ed reform movement. Having run the Future of Education interview series now for 5 years, it's becoming kind of intriguing to me that we have all of these places where there's really good practice, but one place having really good practice never seems to really magnify into a larger shift in thinking. And the conclusion I've come to is that in our desire to identify a better curriculum, we're just mirroring this thought process of imposing a curriculum on top of institutions or individuals. And that what we really need to be thinking about is changing who builds the curriculum. Instead of the practice, the process.
right.
And this is a deep conversation, and it's interesting. I just kind of wanted to raise the red flag a little, which is, I spent 5 years doing open source software in education, and then at the O'Reilly Open Source Open Source Con?
OzCon, yeah.
Well, it wasn't that. It was whatever I spoke at. My talk was, why open source software hasn't changed education. And it was interesting. A lot of us went into the open source movement, I believe, seeing it as a vehicle for shifting how teaching and learning took place, but by describing the better practices, found that it really didn't actually impact anything. And let's kind of merge this with the EdTech amnesia discussion.
Right.
The beginning of my interview series was open source in education. And I interviewed Richard Stallman, Eric Raymond, Brian Bellendorf, all kinds of well-known people in the open source world. And one of the really intriguing pieces was that even though it was an interview series on open source software in education, none of them had actually had their open source or programming experiences inside a traditional education institution.
Right.
Which raises a couple of fascinating ironies. One of which is trying to think about computer science in a traditional curriculum. Like you said, is that really where it takes place? And the second is Silicon Valley thinking that they are going to now change formal learning.
Right.
Where you've got all these CEOs who didn't graduate from school, who didn't learn what they learned in school.
Yeah, I mean, and the piece that I wrote about amnesia was sort of was a result of a number of stories that and blog posts that I read. One of which was Dan Meyer wrote a really, really interesting post this week about what Silicon Valley gets wrong in terms of math education, and he was making the argument that sort of technical solution that Silicon Valley is always going to offer, sometimes it just misses, like it absolutely misses the point. And the wonderful thing was over on Hacker News, which is, I would say, a discussion forum primarily populated by programmers and Silicon Valley tech types, that they sort of missed the discussion. They sort of missed his point so much that they were actually arguing sort of why mathematical notation on the computer sort of is easy to do, and talking about notation and the ways in which we can better create programs for writing math notation, and truly missing what Dan was talking about, which was education, and sort of how do you teach conceptually, how do you teach fractions conceptually, not how do you enter fractions efficiently on your computer.
Well, this brings together a lot of things that we've talked about. I think there was a comment in Dan's, it was either in your piece, I think it was in your blog post, where somebody said, this is like a really big hammer looking for a nail.
Mm-hmm.
Right, it's the technology solution looking for another nail, which reminded me a lot of the Apple textbook initiative. We have a solution looking for a problem.
Right.
Right, and this whole sense of, are a lot of these discussions just red herrings? I mean, do they exist at a level that's not really that productive, not really that disruptive, but they involve a lot of people very actively who don't have to think very deeply to get to this place, which was sort of our ignoring Papert theme.
Yes.
So what's the answer? What can we be doing here to make this a better conversation?
Well, I would add to that too. It was interesting to sort of see who engaged with me on Twitter, and some of the responses from technology ed tech investors that really did say, "Oh yes, you're wrong. It is totally different now, because for the first time ever, we're thinking about computers and personalized learning." And I thought, really go read Papert, please. Please don't ever talk to me again until you've sort of done your homework. Because I do think that there is this sense right now in Silicon Valley that, oh my gosh, wow, technology and education is new, and I think that in terms of making it a better conversation, I think that there's so many different factors involved right now as well, where we're seeing. I think that the amnesia also is occurring partially because of the rapid turnover in a lot of young teachers who don't stay in the profession and who don't come to the profession perhaps with a background in thinking about teaching and learning. And I think that we're losing the longer history of what's happened in education technology, but we're also sort of losing a long history of thinking about the history of education. And Silicon Valley has a very negative view of teachers, very negative. I know that people say, "Oh, we never say that Khan Academy is meant to replace teachers." But if you look at the tenor of the conversations in Silicon Valley, they are very, very anti-teacher.
So it feels as though this is a cognitive trap, right? We've talked about this before, this sort of sense that we're going to come in, we've had success in other places, we see the world through a certain lens, and we believe that we're going to do something nobody else has been able to do. You're trying to bring at least the history of educational technology to the fore, if not the deeper history of pedagogical thinking.
Right.
So if we see this bubble, right, if we see kind of this with some clarity, this bubble coming of a belief in solving, a lot of money being invested, not likely to actually make differences or changes, where we put our energy.
Oh, well, there's the question. I think that, I think that one of the important things to do is actually and one of the things that I try to do is sort of help build some of these bridges, because I don't think necessarily that people. I don't want to paint anybody who's building an education technology startup right now as sort of ignorant or malicious or necessarily sort of a money grubbing it's not a money grubbing, get rich quick scheme for folks. I mean, I think people do want to make a difference. I mean, look at the news that Craig Silverstein left Google this week for Khan Academy. I think that's a pretty interesting and important shift in the Silicon Valley culture. That here's a man who was Sergey and Larry's very first hire. He's been with the company for 13 years, and he's leaving to join an education startup. And probably, I mean, I don't know him, but probably because he wants to make a difference. He wants to do something that good for education. And so I think we have to sort of work to sort of build these bridges between the education and the technology side of the spectrum, because I think that they are very different cultures having conversations in isolation.
But do those people in the venture startup arena even want to have the conversation?
Well, um, some do. I think some do. But I think some find it difficult to have conversations with folks like you or I, because I think we're going to ask questions that they haven't. It's not that they haven't even sort of been prepped for. Like, it's very easy to be prepped for the question, sort of, what's your revenue stream, or how do you plan to market your product? Those are the questions that they're used to having to answer for investors. But I'm not sure that they're used to sort of a deeper, and they're probably used to asking deep questions about their technology infrastructure, right? How do you plan to scale your infrastructure? But I don't know that they're accustomed or have thought about answering questions from educators. And I think some are open to it. But I think that some are resistant to it.
So there's an additional irony here for me, which is, having watched at least some portion of this, having had Larry Cuban on my show a couple of times, whose book you reference, having had the next best thing to Seymour Papert on the show several times, Gary Steger. I can't claim to have the full perspective that I think you and I would both like us each to have, but I feel like I have at least some perspective. And the one of the ironies for me, or the intriguing piece here, is that there is something really significant going on right now with education and technology. And to me, it's the reminder that learning is social.
Yeah.
And that does feel to me as though it really could make a huge difference. But it has a lot less to do with revenue streams and venture financing than it does with sort of rethinking how we approach education as a whole.
Well, I mean, and then too, I would add that it actually, if you say the hot new thing, like this is, sort of, if you say the powerful thing right now is social, learning is social, that's really sort of two steps away from building a Facebook app, which isn't exactly what, I don't think that's exactly what we're talking about. And so I think that even some of the things that we can see as being profoundly different now are sort of still, it's very easy to sort of push those into the obvious places where that would happen in the consumer tech world, which is, again, sort of build a Facebook app, right? Social learning, that must mean sharing your notes on Facebook.
So maybe the thing to do is just to give a message to all those out there who are toiling in obscurity, working on real core ways of rethinking education, who maybe aren't getting the glitzy
Yes.
attention or money. Hang in there. We believe in you.
Exactly.
And
And we'll talk. I mean, and like that's like I said, I spent a lot of time on the phone this week talking to teachers and talking to startups, and I'm always happy to get on. I mean, I even talked to Zach Sims from Code Academy, and I said really mean, awful things about his startup, and we still, we had it out on the phone this week, so it's all good.
how funny. Okay, I guess more to come. Um, what tell us about the pluses and minuses of the new Wolfram Alpha Pro.
Well, I think that Wolfram Alpha tool is fascinating. I think that what Stephen Wolfram has sort of envisioned with his computational knowledge engine is a very different way of thinking about search, right? I mean, thinking about Google, Google's search looks at what the content of web pages and returns what it thinks are sort of the most appropriate web pages based on your query. But the Wolfram Alpha, it thinks of search in a very different way. And I should note that Wolfram Alpha is partially what powers Siri, right? The new voice search on the new voice on the latest iPhone, and partially because it has this, it's this ties back into what Dan Meyer was talking about too. It's supposedly like taking natural language and the way in which we communicate as humans, and then divining what that means and giving us the answer that we want. So it's not the list of the 10 best links in which you might find the answer that you're looking for, but it really is the answer that you want, and interpreting that through how you would input it into a search box. So what they've done this week is that they've started to crack open some of the tools under the hood. With a pro account, you're able to sort of upload your own data. You can download some of the Wolfram Alpha data as well, and it gives you sort of another opportunity to do sort of your own hands-on data analysis, which I think has the potential to be pretty powerful. Unfortunately, I think that there's still a lot of limitations. Both in terms of the way in which Wolfram Alpha licenses their stuff. This is a very closed proprietary technology, right? This is the antithesis of what we were talking about with open source. And also the fact that a lot of the data that's out there is a mess, and it's very hard to sort of upload things and actually have the Wolfram Alpha tool tell you anything of interest.
But you were ready to get your credit card out in the
Well,
same way that you
yeah.
bought an iPhone.
I was ready. I mean, I was ready to get my credit card out, partially because, I mean, one of the other places that I write is for O'Reilly Radar, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about data and what does it mean, sort of how are we going to come to terms and make meaning from all of this data that is in our worlds right now. And I thought that Wolfram Alpha would be a really, if I could wield Wolfram Alpha, that seems like a very, very powerful tool. But like I said in my story, I went to the Department of Education's Open Data website, and of 110 data sets, I couldn't get any of them to work, which I don't think is just, I don't mean that as a slight Wolfram Alpha. It's also, hey, Department of Ed, do a better job with your cleaning up your data. But I think that we still have a long ways to go before we can actually democratize data science tools in that way. I think that it's not quite there yet.
So what we're really looking for is some outlying high school CS teacher who takes all of his students and helps them run through all these data sets and report on why they don't work, right?
Something like that.
Okay, so Jeff Elkner, we're calling your name. And if you don't know who Jeff Elkner is, look him up. Okay, so science, software carpentry, and the discipline to hack. What are you getting at here?
Well, I mean, like I've been thinking a lot this week about sort of how, like, what do we even talk about when we talk about computer science and software engineering? And one of the things, I think that one of the things I realized when I was at Edukon was that a lot of the CS teachers that I was listening to were sort of working with the notion that students in their CS classes were going to sort of grow up to be computer scientists and grow up building programs for others. And I think that what is more likely true is that people need to program for themselves. And I think that if you're building something for yourself, as a programmer, that's a very different thing than building software engineering for other people. And so Greg Wilson, who has a teaching company called Software Carpentry, asked me to help him think through sort of how he's teaching computer science, and he teaches programming to scientists, which is fascinating to me because you would assume, or I think stereotypically you would assume, that scientists have a rigorous background in sort of math and clearly science. But when it comes to engineering and tech skills, there's also this gap in knowledge. And so and for scientists, there is, using software engineering is it's like a necessary evil. It's like statistics class, or like statistics. So you have to sort of use it in your field. And so he wants help sort of thinking through how best do you teach programming? What do you teach in terms of programming if you have a limited amount of time in a blended learning situation, with giving folks enough skills so that they're able to sort of hack together things that make their work easier.
Okay, so you're getting paid for this,
I am
right?
getting paid for this.
Okay, I'm not, so I can give free advice and not be responsible for the outcome. Okay, this reminds me of homeschooling,
Yeah.
right? Which is people taking their children out of the traditional school system and then completely duplicating the school environment at home. In fact, duplicating many of the things that were arguably the reasons for taking them out of the school system. This is the argument you would hear unschoolers make, which is why recreate school at home when you have so many richer possibilities. I remember learning Paradox, the relational database program.
Uh-huh.
It was like finding gold. I mean, it was this unbelievable brain explosion I had. I stayed up for 3 days straight without any sleep, reading every word of the manuals because I could see all of the possibilities of how knowing how to use a relational database was going to change everything I did. I never took a class. I even wonder if the concept of class fits with how people actually learn programming.
I know. See, I mean, and these are the things that I've been just absolutely stewing on this week as well. And oh, I wish I could talk about some news that's going to happen next week. But
you, you keep teasing us. By the time this recording comes out, it'll be so much
okay,
closer, but we can't wait. I know.
okay,
Again,
okay.
the caveat here is I need to say that I'm not getting paid for my opinion here, and I may be completely wrong, and I am not a programmer. I'm a hacker,
Well, see, that's me
but
too.
it
And
just seems like I can't imagine learning one concept a week to program.
well, and I think that again, one of the things that I always ask is sort of, and this is again why thinking about classes, I think, quickly falls apart if we're talking about, or it can quickly fall apart because you're working. I mean, for me, I would imagine that these scientists all have different projects that they're working on, and there are probably different ways in which they're like, I know that this, I've got this sort of set of data, and I'm having to do a bunch of manual stuff. If I could just write a script that would sort of automate it every night, like that's what I need, and like that, and so it's sort of very project focused. It's not sort of like I'm sort of fascinated by fill in the blank with a programming language or a concept, but it is sort of there's a specific goal, which is I know that I'm being grossly inefficient with my practices, and I know that there's a way to automate it, but I just don't have the skills to do that.
Again, this is off the cuff and maybe going too far afield, but it feels to me like the core value or characteristic needed at that point is the willingness to become a hacker rather than to take a class. And it's almost as though, like we've talked about this a lot in my Future of Education interview series, which is engagement trumps content.
Yes.
And you have to have some experiences which allow you to feel the hope that you can actually do something. And it doesn't really matter what that first thing you do is. It's the fact that it actually gets you to a place where you believe, oh, I can actually hack this
Right.
if I just learn enough. And I wonder if that's not really the core value more than the understanding of the programming language.
Although on the flip side of that, I would say that there does have to be some core understanding so that you can actually apply that sensibility to everything you do, and so that it's not just, oh well, I've solved this problem, but that you can actually, that you're able to sort of have that learning sort of go forwards and backwards in in what you undertake. But how
I
that
looked at that software. Go ahead.
oh, I was, but how, but right, but once I think you're right. Once you start talking about a curriculum that way, it does get difficult. I mean, I think it does seem because you're always, but curriculum is it does sort of bind and restrict the content. I mean, that by definition, right?
I've been reading Roland Barthes this week,
Oh, what have you?
and
Well, that explains a
yeah,
lot.
of course, that explains a lot. But it's just another list. It's
Yes.
this sort of easiness of making a list. I looked at that software carpentry topic list, and I wanted to yawn.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it was, okay, so that's not what gets me going. It's this sense that I can actually accomplish something, and that I can. I mean, hack becomes such a good word here.
Yes.
Anyway, I don't think this is isolated to programming. I actually think there's a deeper lesson here. It's the lesson of the self learner. It's the lesson of the autodidact. It's the lesson of how do we really learn, and we're just, I think, continue to explore it as we look through these stories.
Well, and I think that that's sort of why I wanted to frame that in thinking about discipline, right? Because, academic discipline, the way that academic disciplines are set out now, right? Some people will never learn programming. If you think about the discipline, like the separation of disciplines, partially because it just doesn't fit, right? It doesn't fit into the curriculum. And that seems to be troubling. And then partially too, I worry about when we're what happens if we sort of are moving forward with making these assumptions that anybody who's doing the sort of informal learning or sort of extracurricular learning has to be disciplined. Sort of what assumptions are we actually making about learners and their motivation and their commitment? And I don't know. I don't know. I guess I don't know. Sort of, how do we best support so that everybody can sort of become a motivated learner? Is it just as easy as sort of giving people things that they want to do? I don't know.
Well, I think that's a really critical point, which is our cultural narratives have been around discipline in the sense of taking instruction.
Yes.
The classic cartoon in Waiting for Superman of a teacher pouring knowledge into the student's head.
Right.
I mean, that became kind of a flashpoint for a lot of us. So the new narrative, or the resurgent narrative of the self-directed learner, is one we're kind of grappling with here, and recognizing that the list-making kind of top-down hierarchical mandating of learning isn't really how that takes place. And it's not how those open source software guys coded, and it's not likely to be how those data sets are going to get evaluated and improved. It's probably not going to come through a traditional learning environment.
Right.
Lots to keep talking about. Okay, so let's talk about the EdTech news.
Yes.
Your first story is the change, the waivers for 10 states by President Obama. Your sense of the impact of that?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that I think that No Child Left Behind has clearly been has instituted sort of a lot of really dismal things. I mean, I'm a big opponent of standardized testing and high stakes standardized testing. And so I think that No Child Left Behind, certainly that's been its big legacy. But I think that the waivers are sort of like a let's wait and see with the waivers. I think that in some ways, as Valerie Strauss from the Washington Post said, we're really just changing. We're just changing sort of President Bush's vision for President Obama's, and so the ways in which these states have got waivers is actually by agreeing to a lot of the Obama administration's policies, which it's not as though they just sort of ollie ollie awesome free. No one has to do standardized testing anymore, which is
Right. Well, there's that, and that intriguingly sort of parallels this sense of not understanding that trading one vision of mandated education for another is not actually reform.
Right.
But because it's still somebody at the top making decisions.
Right.
I did an interview this week with Alan Blankstein, and I will say probably the most significant book I have read in 30 the last several years. Is the book is called "The Answers in the Room," and the title comes from a quote by Peter Block about how the answer to most problems actually exists within the community, and the essence of a solution is helping the community come together and engage and find the answers within themselves, and that's a process. And certainly I feel as though that's what's really missing here is just, again, these lists and pushing things down. Instead of pushing the process down, we end up pushing the list down.
Yeah.
Okay, off soapbox. Google Books and the lawsuit. I haven't really followed that story. Is there anything we need to know there?
Well, last, I can't remember when it was, middle of the year last year was when the judge sort of threw out the settlement and sort of back to the drawing boards. And what's been interesting to watch as the suit sort of now begins to move forward is that it feels very much like the landscape for digitizing books has completely changed. This lawsuit dates back to, I want to say 2004. When the publishers and the Authors Guild challenged Google's digitization efforts, and it's so interesting now that when we look at sort of the fear was sort of Google will have a monopoly over ebooks, and when we think of it now, that seems so far from the case. We should talk about the Penguin pulling its books from libraries, because really the problem right now seems to be Amazon, and perhaps Apple. And so it's just interesting the speed with which the courts move. That the question of Google sort of being the dangerous force for ebooks and for publishers it's almost sort of laughable at this point. So I imagine that's what Google is going to do, is sort of drag their feet in the courts, and I think I think that things will probably just sort of go away. This particular lawsuit.
What doesn't seem to have gone away is this question about whether or not notes taken by students in class are the intellectual property of the professors.
Yes.
This came to my attention last year because there was a professor in Florida who sued an organization for publishing student notes that was in competition with his own publishing of his notes. It's kind of weird to think of educators owning the copyright to their teaching.
It is very weird. But then it's also, at the same point, I think part of the problem here is the students selling their notes, which is also making commercial use of what you've written in class as a student is also a bit of an odd thing to do. I'm not saying I'm all for sharing your notes, but actually selling your notes is a strange thing as well.
Yeah, bizarre on both sides. It certainly raises questions about what is the role of transmission of information. Mm-hmm. And especially interpretation of information.
Right.
And does somebody own that? We think of teaching as being kind of lighting candles and the room gets brighter and we're sharing, and whose ideas. I'm always stunned to discover upon rereading a book that I've read several years ago, how many of the ideas I've incorporated into my own thinking without actually giving credit.
Yes.
In my own mind to the person who originally introduced them to me. So it gets so fuzzy and gray. Can we really be legalistic here?
Well, and I think too, it also raises questions of sort of what are students doing in the classroom, right? Are they transcribing word for word a lecture, and what and how does that help with their own their own sort of understanding of a particular course? And so I think it's, if a student just sees itself as sort of as a transcriptionist of the material that the professor delivered, again, sort of what's happening in the sort of, I think it raises sort of interesting questions about sort of practices on the parts of students in the classroom as well.
Yeah, or just a reminder that that whole system of thinking that knowledge gets transferred that way, yes, rather than actively participating in it. We'll move on. Okay,
well, let's talk about.
I lost my place.
Well, I guess this is jumping around on my list, but let's talk about Pearson or Pearson. Well, okay, Pearson, Penguin.
Wait, we haven't really dealt with Apple this week or with Pearson.
But let's.
Go for it.
Well, so I think it was a couple of weeks ago that we talked about that the ALA was going to sort of have a sit down meeting with the major publishers and sort of talk about how to move this conversation forward. Of the big six publishers, well, I think now just two of them will actually offer their books as their ebooks as loans to libraries, and that's as literature becomes as patrons are more interested in ebooks, the fact that you can only get two of the big six is I think is really a problem. So they had a sit down meeting, and apparently it didn't go very well because Penguin announced that effective immediately, no longer will you be able to check out ebooks through Overdrive in libraries, and Overdrive is the main one of, I would say, the main distributor for ebook content to libraries in this country. So, yeah, I think that the sort of, as people have dug into the question, actually, the problem according to Penguin wasn't just sort of what happens with ebooks as this sort of a loss of control over their content, was that they are very unhappy with the deals that Overdrive made with Amazon for its Kindle lending library. And so this is a battle between the publishers and Amazon that unfortunately libraries and library patrons are sort of have the rough end of it.
You didn't report on this, and I'm not even sure it falls into the category of the things we would normally talk about, but we do rent movies from Amazon, and they now have this new process where people can storyboard movies and then get feedback on them. Have you seen this yet?
I haven't.
It's the sort of the fascinating aspect of it is how dramatically easy it is to imagine this radically altering how movies get made. In the same way that now Amazon is publishing books, right? The idea that it's actually very smart to storyboard a movie or do a rough cut of it, post it up, let people watch it for free on Amazon, and then actually, if people like it, get funding from that, which of course Amazon is likely to be involved in, to me was a brilliant move. And of course, this has got to be scaring traditional filmmakers and studios in the same way that Amazon's role in publishing has to be really scaring publishers.
Yeah, well, I think that there are lots of issues at stake here, and I think that clearly the record industry is, of course, what we look to when we talk about what happens when an industry sort of denies the fact that consumers want digital. They want the content digitally, and the record industry was sort of very slow to sort of wake up to digitized music. And I think for a long time that's why people weren't pirating music, because they were sort of cheapskates out to sort of stick it in the eye of Arista Records, but because people love music, and I think people love books in the same way. And I think that the publishing industry is is making it very difficult, for libraries, making it very difficult for people to sort of get their hands on content. And sort of what will it mean what are the implications for for the industry in terms of piracy, and I think in terms of the role of the library as well. I think it's quite troubling.
So Clayton Christensen is smiling himself to the bank every day, having described so brilliantly this process of how large companies respond to disruptive innovations. So Google, my turn. Blackboard unveils their latest version of the LMS, Blackboard Ocho. Did you actually watch that briefing?
I was going to
because I did not.
I was going to attend the one that they had some technical difficulties with, and I did not.
We're snickering because the irony here is, having bought Illuminate now having Blackboard Collaborate as a synchronous platform, they chose to do the briefing in WebEx. What was it?
Yeah, WebEx,
I can't remember.
and it didn't
And
work.
it didn't go. I don't think anybody at Blackboard's going to be mad at me about laughing about that. But
But still. But
anyway, so that was scheduled for later in the day, and I missed it as
yeah,
well.
I missed it as well. And I thought, it actually is interesting to sort of watch Blackboard's sort of watch Blackboard finally. I mean, and I do mean finally recognize that the user experience in their product is cause for immense frustration. And so the new and improved Blackboard is apparently all sorts of Web 2.0 ish looking. So bully for them.
Like, good. Good news on the Android App Inventor front.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah, this is exciting. I
Go
mean,
ahead.
this is exciting. Google shut down its Google Labs last year, which was really sad because there were a lot of great little projects housed under experimental projects housed under Google Labs, and one of them was Android App Inventor, which is actually a lot like Scratch. It allows sort of a building blocks to help you build mobile apps, and Android App Inventor sort of got the axe as part of Google Labs being closed, but Google's actually handed the project over to MIT. And MIT have released the source code, but they're working on having a beta version for release soon. And if you're a teacher who uses Android App Inventor, they'd like to hear from you, and you're welcome to. I think you'll get sort of first dibs on your hands on the new Android App Inventor.
Okay. And a couple of upgrades to products: Zotero, Learn Boost, and Show Me.
Yep, it's always interesting, sort of my trying to figure out which companies to highlight each week. But Zotero is a really interesting open source project out of gosh, George Mason. No, yes, George Mason University. That it's a sort of a citation bibliography citation tool, and I love professors who hack on building their own solutions here. So Zotero, if you're a scholar or if you do anything in which you have to sort of track on a bibliography, I recommend Zotero.
Okay, and we're getting close to end here, but there are some stories we just can't miss. So the first one for me is the news out of California on state funding for libraries being axed.
Yeah,
And you speechless is hard to imagine. So let's change that.
I mean, I am. I mean, I can't imagine of the. I mean, I do recognize that these are difficult financial times for states, but I cannot imagine looking at all of the budget items in the state budget and deciding that you're going to zero out funding for libraries. That boggles my mind.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with David Lurcher about this, who's big in the library world, and his particular push is libraries as learning commons. And I think the admission there is that this is not just an external issue, that it also is requiring librarians to rethink their own capacity. Clearly, the skills that we idealize in a librarian are at the heart of thinking about teaching and learning in this new world. But oftentimes it's librarians themselves who don't understand that.
Well, I mean, I mean, I think too, I mean, I recognize sort of we've talked a lot about the library, sort of the library being at the forefront of a lot of these sort of digital shifts and community shifts. But I think that what makes me so sad about this is that I've long thought that the library is the community center and the place to go when, like, if you can't afford to buy a book, you can go to the library and read a book. And so the fact that in tough economic times the locus of sort of community literacy in all of its forms, and I mean that from like literally sort of reading and writing to digital literacy to finding out where in your city where you can register to vote, to talk to a research librarian about how do you file for a restraining order. Where would you go to find that information in the library? It's such an important place for learning and community learning. I really can't believe that that the state of California has no option but to zero out its funding.
Now, that doesn't mean that libraries will have no funding.
No,
Do
no.
they get local funding?
There is local funding, and there's I mean there are plenty of sort of federal grant programs that fund different elements and different aspects of what libraries do. But under in the state of California, there's also sort of state funded literacy programs that are under that as well. And so this is actually a blow to literacy in the state of California.
Stunning. Another big piece of news, although with more limited implications, Google's first employee is moving on.
Yeah, this is. I have to say, congratulations to Betsy at EdSurge for breaking this story. And like I wrote in my write up, curses to anybody that didn't actually credit EdSurge with breaking that story. It's one of
Now,
my.
those curses might be directed toward the Wall Street Journal.
Well, I think that they said some news. I think they called it sort of some newsletter. Some newsletter broke the story, and it's one of my pet peeves when old media and new media don't do a good job of sort of citing their sources. And with the beauty of the hyperlink, it isn't too difficult to point your readers to www.edsurge.com and give her credit for the story. But yes, so Craig Silverstein, who was the first hire at Google, is moving on. He's going to Khan Academy, where he doesn't even know. It's not quite clear what he's doing yet. But he said that he thinks he'll be programming. So, but he's interested. He's often described as one of the people responsible for making Google googly, and so that it'll be interesting to see sort of what the cultural shift will be in terms of Google if they are losing their lead googly person, and also at Khan Academy, which doesn't particularly strike me as a very googly place.
Probably not news given all that we've talked about textbooks, but it sounds like the use of digital textbooks has actually gone down.
Yeah, this isn't. I mean, I don't think it's surprising in some ways either. According to the Book Industry Study Group, and these aren't sort of numbers from sales per se. This is based on a survey of college students. So I should clarify that. But those college students reported that they were actually using digital textbooks less this year than they were in 2010. And I mean, there can be we've talked a lot about why college students don't particularly like ebooks yet or e-textbooks yet, but I think it's again an interesting reminder that despite all of the excitement and hullabaloo about digitizing textbooks, that students still have a lot of reason to buy the print one.
And did you report it at some point, and did we talk about how many students report they actually use the textbooks for courses?
I remember reporting on something about that a while ago, but I think that students, textbooks are a major financial burden for college students, and I think that a lot of them do opt to not buy them because I think that they've sat in enough classes before where they've shelled out money, big money, and then never opened it or read just one chapter and so I think that college students are sort of wising up to sort of how much money they're spending on textbooks, and clearly digital textbooks don't save them money.
Interesting. I just keep trying to think about my own courses in college and the use of textbooks, and would I, for the ones where I did read them, would I have wanted them digitally? And the truth is, next to me right now are about 30 books piled high because I still like the print and I still like to be able to write in the margins.
Yeah, I'm a big, and for me, I mean, my skepticism of textbooks is probably, well, come back to the discipline. I'm a literature person, and so I never assigned textbooks. I never read a lot of textbooks, and so textbooks to me sort of seem like this weirdly artificial sort of thing that I have no interest in. And I do a lot of reading now with in a Kindle. But I definitely am a write in the margin person, and it is not as enjoyable experience to do that in a digital textbook yet.
I have used the phrase fire your textbooks in several conversations, and people respond very positively to it. So if that really takes off, I want credit from the Wall Street Journal for having invented that phrase.
I'll write them a
In some
nasty letter if they don't link to your website.
in some good news, Google Summer of Code is launched again.
Yes, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of the Summer of Code project. Is a great one. This is a great opportunity to get students, and I should say here that you don't actually have to be a CS student either. I mean, you need some programming skills, but you don't actually have to be a CS student. And they put you to work on coding programs with different open source organizations around the world. I mean, and that includes places like Wikipedia, and the folks from the open source office at Google are among the finest of Googlers. So.
Good. And also, arguably good news, which I wasn't aware of until I read your notice on it, is this Harvard Conference on Teaching and Learning.
Yes, this one I think elicits some chuckles because finally, higher ed realizes that there's actually perhaps a problem with teaching and learning at the university level. And I think this is probably something that most of us who've been to college have realized that a lot of the faculty at college are really lousy teachers. And sort of what can we do to help make what can we do to sort of help make sure that the teaching that happens in higher ed is actually effective, and that it's not just folks sort of it's not sort of just relying on the lecture model, which I mean I think although it's possible to. I mean, I think we've probably been and heard good lectures, but really lectures are sort of one of the least effective ways to sort of get to sort of help the kids learn.
And again, this kind of brings us back full circle to this whole idea of when the technology discussions actually lead to discussions of teaching and learning, that feels really healthy. Right, so it feels like the flipped classroom discussions have led us to really talking about teaching and learning, and so the idea that the core conversation is teaching and learning rather than technology.
Yes,
you got to like that.
Exactly.
Is this the first time you've done recommended reading?
It is.
Did I just ask?
It is the first time, and there were, like I said, there were a couple of really interesting stories this week that made me think a lot. I think. Karima Ani from Mathlicious writing about Khan Academy. I thought it was what he wrote was very bold. And watching him be raked over the coals for it, again, by a lot of folks in the Silicon Valley community is sort of unfortunate. Dan Meyer always makes me think a lot. And in fact, I'm having coffee with Dan Meyer this week, so I win.
Oh, good.
and then
so you have to look at this. Is a guy you actually have to really look up to. Because he's tall.
So I'm excited.
I have to look up to Dan Meyer.
Really? He's that tall? Okay. Well,
I would say he's 6'6".
Wow. Okay.
6'7", maybe.
Good. Well, I'm excited. We've never met face to face, so that's going to be fun. And then George Siemens, who wrote a very interesting piece, I think, about he's making lots of moves towards. I mean, sort of a person who's been at the forefront of sort of open education and massive online open courses. He's now sort of working into sort of how can we build out open analytics and open other open frameworks around it. So important stuff.
Good. Well, you do important stuff, Audrey, and it's most appreciated. So can't wait to hear whatever news is coming out.
Oh, it's going to be good.
I'm glad to hear it. We'll look forward to it. Take care, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks.